Wow, this is worse than I thought.
Is it really that bad?
Hello everybody and welcome back to Fluffy Tarantulas. I'm Sky and I've been keeping tarantulas for around half a decade, and as you can see behind me, especially by this little kitty over here, this is Pinky. I have a lot of tarantulas and a lot of experience, but today I decided to put myself in the shoes of, once again, just newly going into and owning tarantulas and just really tackle what beginners are told. Now, I went to PetSmart today and I found one of these pamphlets regarding tarantulas and scorpions. And of course, if you're a beginner and you see one of these, you're gonna think, this is amazing, this is like a godsend. I needed all the information and I'm glad that I have it all in one place. And you would want to trust this because it comes from a pet store that's selling you tarantulas, and you would assume that they know a lot since they have been in this industry for a long time. But that is very incorrect as displayed by this little pamphlet. Now, I'm really going to break down all of the things that are just really awful advice and could possibly get your tarantula and scorpion killed. Now, obviously, I'm more of a tarantula person, but I do own a scorpion. His name is Harry Styles. He's a little lower down here. He's still pretty small, but I've had him for a few years. He's a little bit hidey, and a lot of the rules in here are a little better for him, but a little worse for any tarantula that you want to keep. But I'll be tackling which ones are bad for both of them and which ones you need to look out for just tarantulas. I'm not sure why they would lump these two together. I guess because they think they're both like arachnids, that it would be fine, but realistically. Now, first, let's do a little general reading on this pamphlet. Now, on the left side of this pamphlet, we got a little basic info. Of course, they lump tarantulas and scorpions together, which is a little bit like lumping cats and dogs together. But let's just take a little look. First, it says, scorpions and tarantulas are primarily nocturnal, but several species are often seen out during the day roaming or basking. This is correct, very general info. You could see I've got somebody roaming around all the time. A lot of my tarantulas spend quite a bit of their time outside of their cages. You can see a little Stinky over here. Pretty general info. Now, for experience level, I do agree that tarantulas can be a beginner species, really depending on species. I would recommend curly hairs and maybe Arizona blondes as a beginner species, but old world species definitely are not beginner species. Anything that's not from the Americas is always a little bit more aggressive and a little bit harder to keep. Some tarantulas have some crazy needs, and they can get pretty intense, especially for a beginner. It can cause a lot of stress, so it's better to have one of these chill tarantulas while you really learn about just the way they act, their demeanors, what they need, how to recognize their needs, because tarantulas do not work on like a daily clock like a lot of other animals do. You don't feed them every day. Sometimes you don't feed them every week. And it's just really important to learn how to identify what they need in the moment rather than try to follow a fixed daily schedule. Next, we have some basic size info. This is all generalizations. Scorpions usually don't grow super fast, so I assume they sell adults mostly, but if you're getting a baby, you're probably going to have a scorpion that's like smaller than 6 inches for a while. And of course, some will get a little bigger than 8 inches. Well, they say tarantulas are 4 to 6 inches, but you know, I have a T. Sturmy down here, my Goliath bird eater, who is like 12 inches at least. You know, they can get big. For lifespan, they say 5 to 8 years for scorpions. Some can live a little longer than that. And tarantulas, 4 to 20 years. It's pretty accurate for like generalizing tarantulas, but some males may only live like around 3 years in maturity, and some females can live like 25 years. So I'm not gonna really bother with this basic info. It is very generalized, and that's okay. Continuing a little further, we can kind of see the first controversial point. They have a little diagram, a little drawing of a beautiful bee smithy, which I have right here. Her name is Pumpkin, which is a terrestrial tarantula. They love having like some walking room. They don't really dig too much, and they don't need a lot of height. But as we can see, they have her in an enclosure that's a little bit more tall than it is wide. And if we look at the substrate, it looks more like this wood chip substrate, which is not very good for their feet. I would always recommend coconut fiber or other kinds of softer dirt for your tarantula's feet. Maybe even mix in a tiny bit of sand if you want to spice it up, but nothing super rough like this. A bigger issue we can identify with their tarantula enclosure is the mesh lid. While scorpions do not really have an issue with mesh lids because they don't often climb on the ceilings, and if you leave enough space where they can't get up there, they'll never interact with the mesh. But with tarantulas, they can climb the glass, they can climb the plastic, all of these slick surfaces, they find a way up. With that comes the issue of tarantulas getting their feet stuck. Now, when I was a beginner tarantula and I got my first little guy, I fell into this trap too. The pet store told me that this enclosure up here, the pet store told me that this was the best enclosure for the Arizona blonde tarantula that I adopted. As you can see, it's very square and it's got a mesh lid. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but mesh lids can pose a serious threat to your tarantulas. If you've met anybody who's been in the hobby for quite a minute or has more experience, you'll know that they hate mesh lids. Tarantulas, they have little claws at the end of their feet, and if they get stuck here, they can lose a leg or they can hang there and they can die or pose serious injury. It's just overall not a good experience. Now, why do I have this enclosure? This enclosure was $75. It is my most expensive enclosure besides my Goliath's enclosure, which is like 3 feet long. Why did I get this? The pet store convinced me and they told me it was the best, so of course, wanting the best for my tarantulas, I followed their advice, but sadly, this was not a good enclosure for my Arizona blonde at all. But I do have something else in here. As you can see by the tunnel, this is a fossorial tiger tarantula. It is a youngin and he will never really be out, so I'm not worried about him climbing at the top at all. So he is currently using this as a grow out tank. I mean, I could show you a little bit of him if you see the bottom. Now you can see a glimpse of the little guy's stomach there. It's pretty hard to see, he's always buried, so I'm not worried about him touching the mesh or anything really. But overall, I would really not recommend those kinds of enclosures for any sort of tarantula keeper. They pose too much risk, and it's just a very simple trap to fall into whenever you're being advised at the pet store about what's great for your tarantula and what's going to give them the best life. But in reality, it's really hard to know about these things, especially when the people at the pet store don't own a tarantula, or maybe they don't have experience, or they don't know these little niche things. It's very important to just do a little bit of your own research. Now, the enclosures I recommend generally for almost every spider is these Reptzilla enclosures. They have arboreal ones and they have terrestrial ones, and for the majority of tarantulas who just need one or the other, they are perfect. They give you quite a bit of roaming distance. For your terrestrials, you can put a little bit of dirt in there, a couple of inches, and for the arboreals, there's plenty of climbing space. I really support them, and that's why I have so many of their enclosures. These enclosures over here, the one that I have my tailless whip scorpion in, is from Amazon. It's not the same brand, but I also have one for my OBT, and it can hold a lot more dirt. I recommend it for big fossorials. Let's take a look at the right side of the pamphlet before we go too far with one subject. This states that at least 1 to 2 times a year, or juveniles will do it more frequently, these animals will molt. Usually, if you have an adult tarantula, you're not going to see a molt every year. And that can be a little concerning if you're reading this and you're thinking, Am I having growth problems? Is my tarantula okay? Am I feeding enough? Is it stressed? But a lot of tarantulas do not molt every year. Some will go years without molting, and some will go even longer, you know? Adults don't molt too much. It says later on that if you suspect your pet is molting, do not handle or disturb them for 48 to 72 hours. If you still notice issues, consult your veterinarian. Now, this is a little bit scary. Tarantulas can go into pre-molt for months, so you don't really want to be too concerned if they are. A lot of them will not go through this whole process in 2 to 3 days. They need a lot more time to settle down, to flip over, and to really get out of their skin. Now, pre-molt lasts way longer than an actual molt. So, if you see your tarantula is laying on its back, that's a good sign that it's molting right now, and you don't want to touch it for the next week, at least a week. Because they're so soft, they're so prone to stress, and 2 to 3 days is not enough. Now, tarantulas will exhibit their pre-molt behavior for even months beforehand. Sometimes babies will show the signs for months beforehand, so you don't really want to stress about it too much. They'll stop eating, they'll be a little bit slower, maybe they're building a little bit of a web and just overall kind of doing nothing. They just might be in pre-molt, and it's a good time to let them be. I've had tarantulas who have fasted for years at a time, usually my adult females, and I've had babies who have fasted for months at a time going into pre-molt. And it's really nothing to be concerned about, so don't let this pamphlet scare you about their behavior. They don't need to be checked up on every day or like every other day to see if they're active and eating again. They'll be fine for months, you know. Next up, we have how do I set up a scorpion or tarantula terrarium? Firstly, it suggests a 5 to 10 gallon terrarium, which I would not recommend aquariums or like those kinds of tanks for your tarantulas or your scorpions. A lot of the time they come with the mesh lid and they're just kind of inconvenient. They're not really as well accessible as these kinds of enclosures. You could definitely use them and make do with them if you get a better lid, but overall they're not really the best choice. And then next it says line the terrarium with a combination of sphagnum moss, coconut fiber, or bark and sand. This is not really great advice considering it states having bark and it only says 2 to 3 inches of substrate. Now, even the simplest tarantulas are gonna want a little more than that. Most tarantulas love to dig, especially if they're babies, and you want to give them like 4 to 6 inches of substrate, maybe even more. If you have a fossorial tarantula, you could even do like 8 or 12 inches of substrate. They will use it all. They love to dig. You could see the little guy I showed you up here a second ago used all the dirt that he has, and he has quite a bit, and he's still a baby, you know? He's like this big. He's not an adult. So it's definitely, you need to give more substrate, and don't use that rough bark substrate. It's not good on their feet. It's not good on their abdomen. Their abdomen is their most sensitive part, and you don't really want anything scratching at it. Next, it suggests to add large and stable live or artificial branches around the habitat for climbing and hiding. Branches is not a good term, I would say, to use. It's great to add wood to your enclosures, but I always recommend bark. Wide pieces of bark, maybe a little bit of a curve. You can use them as hides, you can use them as climbs, and they work fantastic. You can see I have a ton on my arboreals. Everybody's got a piece of wood, but never just branches. They get stressed by branches, they can't really climb on them. They're big creatures, you know? It's difficult to hold on to, it's difficult to work with, and if you only have branches in there, especially if you have an arboreal tarantula like my pink toe, they're gonna get stressed out, and they're just gonna, you know how stress works, it just takes a toll on them, and sometimes they'll even die when they can't maneuver their enclosure well and they're constantly falling because these branches are so thin. It's not a good story. I recommend always just using cork bark park, if you're going to a local pet store, maybe more of a specialty reptile store, get that cork bark. They love this stuff. Or you can go outside and find some pieces of bark, dry them out, and bake them in the oven at like 180 degrees Fahrenheit for about like an hour or two to kill any bacteria, and you'll be golden. I have a ton of cork bark in these enclosures, but in this enclosure back here, I made all that wood myself. Just the stuff I was finding while hiking, and oh, they love it. It works great. Now let's move on a little further to the last big block of text on this side, and it states that scorpions and tarantulas require a temperature gradient, which means a cool side and a warm side of the enclosure, and to use a heat lamp. Now, heat lamps with tarantulas are not the best idea, especially with this enclosure that they're showing. They have such a tiny enclosure. How are you going to make a hot side and a cold side when your enclosure is like barely a foot long? You know what I mean? Tarantulas aren't the best thermoregulators. They're very comfortable at room temperature. Just 70 to 80 degrees is great for them. If you have if you have good temperatures in your house, they're going to do completely fine with that. A heat lamp can just dehydrate them a lot. It can suck the moisture out of the enclosure, or they can overheat. I've heard a lot of stories of tarantulas overheating from their heat lamp, and it's really unfortunate, especially when people are being recommended to put heat lamps in their tarantula enclosures, especially in such small enclosures where, you know, you can't really run from the heat. It's just not a great idea to put heat lamps in an enclosure. They're not required for tarantulas. It's just another expense. I have a heat lamp or two that I was using for hermit crabs, but tarantulas are never really benefiting from that kind of thing. Other reptiles, yes, but for these arachnids, not very good. If you had a huge enclosure is the only time that I see that it would work out. If you have one, say, like as long as I have my Goliath enclosure, then yeah, sure, put one on one side if it makes you more comfortable. But usually they just don't need that kind of concentrated heat. They just need the general temperature of a room to be better for them. They need that kind of constant, soothing temperature. It's kind of like how you wouldn't put a heat lamp on your cat. You would rather have the house be a more comfortable temperature. It's just too much of a risk to like overheat, dehydrate your tarantula. They don't really drink straight up water that much. Next, it says to equip the habitat with a thermometer and a hydrometer, and to keep it at a certain constant humidity, which they say 70 to 80% for general advice, and then they say for a pink toe and a curly toe, 70 to 90%, and for a striped knee and a Mexican red knee, 30 to 70% humidity. I'm not really sure where they kind of lump these numbers. Of course, it's great for your tarantula to have a lot of humidity, especially when they are in pre-molt. That is their most, they need the most moisture. It helps them with their exoskeleton. But overall, you're going to want to make sure that you have some fluctuating humidity within your tarantula's enclosures. You can overflow their water bowls and wet the substrate maybe once a week. And then you're going to want to maybe mist if you want. You can mist every day instead, but I really recommend wetting the substrate and misting it for that boost of moisture, and then letting that dry out completely just to make sure you avoid mold and mites growing, stuff like that. It can really escalate in constant humidity, and you kind of want some of that fluctuation within your enclosure. It just helps that kind of personal ecosystem not really develop, especially if you don't have bioactive features in your enclosures like springtails or isopods that wouldn't deal with the mold or anything like that. You're going to want to do this kind of cycle of letting your tank dry out and then re-moisturizing it on about a weekly basis. Next, we have, what should I feed my scorpion or tarantula? Now, I agree with them stating that you would feed them gut-loaded insects. That's a great rule of thumb for almost any animal, even reptiles who are eating these kinds of animals. Whenever you bring a cricket home, they kind of went through war times with their past pet stores, they don't feed them that well. So what I do to gut load my crickets is I give them some of these just cheap fish flakes. It gives them a lot of protein, a lot of nutrients, and then maybe I throw in some fruit scraps and I give them some water and I just let them go at it for around like 24 hours, maybe just 8 hours if I'm in a rush, and they are fully fed and ready to go. I have a lot of dubia roaches growing for my tarantulas, but if you don't really keep that many tarantulas, you wouldn't really find a need to have this kind of breeding going on. They don't really require too much food, so you'd be fine with buying crickets every once in a while. But if you do have the space for a little dubia roach colony, I do recommend that. They are great food. I think dubia roaches are some of the best food for tarantulas. That's just my personal take. I love dubia roaches. Next, it says to remove any uneaten insects within 24 hours, which is completely correct. The biggest danger with uneaten insects is just if they are alive, which you usually feed your tarantula alive. If this tarantula had gone into a molt, then that little bug could kill it. This tarantula is way too soft, way too just vulnerable, and even a little cricket can kill your tarantula and stress it out. So that's why whenever a tarantula is molting, you want to just not touch it, not feed it, not put anything in the enclosure or change anything for like a week until they harden up a bit and they're ready to defend themselves again. But the issue here is that the pamphlet says to feed daily or every other day. Now, neither scorpions or tarantulas will ever need to eat this much. Usually, if you feed them that much, they're gonna explode. Tarantulas and scorpions are opportunistic eaters, and they will take whatever they can get because they don't know when the next food is coming. So they'll just eat until essentially they pop. You don't really want a tarantula or a scorpion that's too heavy. It's really unhealthy for them. It can pose a lot of health risks. They can get abdominal ruptures, which is life-threatening. And overall, you just kind of want to judge based on the abdomen how much your tarantula needs to eat. If they have a good full abdomen, they are completely fine and they don't need to eat again. If it's a little smaller, go ahead and feed them a couple more. Usually you'll only have to feed them every week or two. If they're a baby, maybe twice a week, but you always just want to keep an eye out on the abdomen and judge for yourself. Now, they are correct with the water where they say scorpions and tarantulas rarely drink from a dish, but to have a shallow one available at all times. This is great advice. You don't really want a deeper one because you don't want a baby to drown, but usually adults don't have this issue. And it's very good to always have a water dish in case they need that quick moisture, even though they get most of their hydration from the food they eat, which is why you want to really make sure you water those crickets before you feed them to your tarantula. Lastly, I think is the most worrying one because it describes a lot of completely normal tarantula behaviors and states that they are a cause for concern. It says, when should I contact a veterinarian? Contact your exotic animal veterinarian if you notice the following signs. Number 1, hiding more than usual. Now, tarantulas are going to hide. If you introduce them to an enclosure and they find a comfy spot, they're going to hide there forever. A lot of my tarantulas have not come out of their hide for months, and this is completely normal. It's just how they function. They feel the safest inside their burrows. They love feeling hidden, and that's just how they protect themselves in the wild. They're not really going to be running around the enclosure a lot. Some of them do, as you can see, but a lot of them love to hide. They love to burrow and stay hidden from their predators. It's just completely normal behavior for them. If they're going into pre-molt, they may want to block themselves off from the real world for a couple of months, and that is healthy and normal behavior. Next, it says eating or drinking less, which is also not a cause for concern. If they are eating and drinking less, most likely your tarantula is going into pre-molt, and it does not want to be bothered, and it does not need any more nutrients before it goes into its molting period. A lot of tarantulas will also just fast because they want to. I've had tarantulas who haven't eaten or drinking for like 2 years straight, and they are completely fine and completely healthy. The only time I would say it is a concern is if your tarantula's abdomen is looking very shrunken, kind of like a raisin, and that's when I would pose some concern for it, because that could mean your tarantula is sick or dehydrated. And in that case, I would recommend misting the enclosure a little bit more and trying to offer a little more food if it wants to take it, and then maybe calling up your exotic pet expert or veterinarian to get some more information on that. But if your tarantula's abdomen is looking great, which it usually will be, and they are just fine and just antisocial, then you are good to go. Next, we see difficulty molting. Usually if your tarantula is having a molting emergency, it is a little bit too late. If your tarantula gets stuck in a molt, there's not really a way you can help them out. They are just too sensitive. But a good way to prevent this is just making sure when they're in that pre-molt stage that they get proper humidity and that the food that they were eating before is proper and nutritious for them. Usually they will have a great time, but sometimes accidents do happen, and when a molt is going wrong, you cannot really help the tarantula. You can miss the enclosure a little bit, but that's pretty much it. It's usually an unfixable kind of thing, and it's really difficult to help those kind of natural causes. Next, we have reluctant to move, broken or lost limb. This one's very concerning because I imagine it happens often enough for them to state it, because they are recommending mesh lids, and mesh lids are just known for tearing those legs off or just killing their tarantulas. They'll fall from them, hit their abdomen, and then they'll get like the tarantula equivalent of a really bad concussion, and they could die from that. And sometimes, as I've had experience with, I adopted 7 when she only had 7 legs. Her past owner had a similar situation where she was not properly taken care of, and with a kind of lid like this and improper handling, she had lost a leg, which she has since regrown in my care. But you just want to make sure to stay away from those mesh lids and those kinds of things, and make sure your tarantula does not have too much height to fall from if they are not an arboreal tarantula, and you will be safe from any of this hecticness. Additionally, make sure if you plan to handle your tarantula that you do it over the floor or a soft cushion instead of in the air, because any small drop can really deal some real damage to them. Never force your tarantula to do anything, and you will not encounter this kind of problem. Next, we have an abdominal wound, which I assume is from them recommending to feed them so often that they can get even an abdominal rupture, which usually is fatal, and you cannot do much about that. There isn't really tarantula surgery. Sometimes you can take a little something to patch up the wound, but it's just not really a good thing. You can't really fix such a thing, which is why you just want to monitor what you're feeding your tarantula, how the abdomen is looking to make sure they are not overeating, overfeeding, anything like that. Now, the last thing it states, which is not a cause for concern usually, is hair loss. A tarantula will go bald for a multitude of reasons. If they like to kick, they'll kick all of their abdominal hairs off and they'll go a little bit bald. They'll have a tiny bald spot. Sometimes they just get this from aging, particularly if you have an adult male, and sometimes this just happens before they molt because they'll take those abdominal hairs out and they'll lay them in their web to make it a little more secure for themselves. And overall, you're always going to have a bald tarantula at some point. It's pretty uncommon to have a tarantula that was never bald. So do not really concern about the baldness of a tarantula, unless it's like a rupture or something, but they'll get their hair back in the next molt and they will be golden again. Now that we have gone over everything, it's really important to acknowledge the information that these pet stores give us and to take it with a grain of salt and do our own research for the animals that we want to keep, because these pet stores are just not reliable. The workers there usually do not have experience with the particular animal that you want to keep, and with exotics, there's just kind of a lot of misinformation spreading around and all of that jazz, so it's better to seek out more experienced opinions, there are great channels out there such as the Tarantula Collective that give a lot of great information about tarantulas if you are planning to keep or own one, or you just want to check in on your husbandry and make sure it is the best possible husbandry for your tarantula. Thank you for tuning into this video. I really appreciate all of your support and all of your attention and time listening to my little ramble about this pet store pamphlet. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.